Hey guys, welcome to Tech Vitals. Today we will be continuing our lesson of object-oriented programming in Python, and today we will discuss about class variables in OOP. In the previous lesson, we discussed about instance variable and instance objects. So we did something like this. We created a class. So let's say class of employee. Then in that class, we defined the dunder init method and we initialized some instance variables, so like first name, last name, address, and so on. So inside this init function, we can initialize the instance variable. So self.firstName will be first name, self.lastName will be last name, and self.address will be address. So if we create an object of this class employee, so example employee1 equals employee, and then if we pass the values for these three variables, so first name, last name, and address, so let's say John Smith, and address, let's say New York. Now here we created an object emp1 for this employee class with these three instance variables. So here self will take the value emp1, then here the emp1.firstName will be John, then emp1.lastName will be Smith, and emp1.address will be New York. So we can print the values emp1.firstName, emp1.lastName, and emp1.address. And if we print this, we have John, Smith, and New York. So this self.firstName, self.lastName, and self.address, these are instance variables because the values for these three variables will be different for each instance. So if we create another object, let's say emp2, and we pass some different values, so let's say Paul, Willis, and let's say Massachusetts, and now if we print emp2.firstName, emp2.lastName, and emp2.address, and try to run this. So the first name, last name, and address for employee 1 is this, and the first name, last name, and address for employee 2 are this. So for each instance or for each object of class employee, we can have distinct instance variables. But when we talk about class variable, then that means all the instances will share that variable, or it is like a common variable for all of the objects or all of the instance. For example, let's say we are creating this class employee for the company of YouTube. So the company of all the employees must be YouTube. So we can define the class variable outside of any function. So within the class but outside of any function, we can define company equals YouTube. Now since this YouTube is a class variable because it is defined within a class but outside of any class function or class method, each and every instance or each and every object of this class employee will have the same value YouTube for the variable company. So we can either access this company variable using the class name. So we can say employee.company, and if we print this, so let's comment these earlier print statements, and now let's print this employee.company. It will print YouTube. Or we can also access this company variable using the object name. So here we have employee1 and here we have employee2. So we can also use emp1.company and emp2.company. Now since this is a class variable and it is a common variable for each instances, so when we print emp1.company and emp2.company, both of these will print the same value, that is YouTube. So if we print this, then we get YouTube for employee1 and YouTube for employee2 as well. Now, instead of using this company as a class variable, we can also use this as an instance variable like this. So we can just add company argument in this init method, and then we can do self.company equals company. Now since we are creating the employee class for YouTube company, we will always pass the same value, that is YouTube for this employee1 and YouTube for employee2. And if we create more object of the employee class, then we will always pass the same value YouTube. So it makes more sense to define this company variable as class variable, because that way all the objects or all the instances will have the same value for that variable. So we can remove this company as the instance variable and we can declare it as a class variable. Now in the previous lesson we also learned about dunder str method. So we can create dunder str and then we can return, let's say, the first name. So self.firstname. Now if we print the object, so let's say if we print emp1, then it should print the first name of this employee1, that is John. And if we print emp2, then it should print Paul. And now since we removed that company variable as an instance variable, we can also remove this YouTube from both of the object. And now if we try to run this, it should print John and Paul. So we get John and Paul. Now let's say in this dunder str method we want to return the first name and the company name. Then we have to return first name, comma, company. Now as you can notice, it is showing some error. It is showing this red underline. That means there is something wrong with this line or with this code. And that is because inside any function of class, the variable should be passed either as a class variable or the instance variable. So if we just write company, then it is not clear whether it is a class variable or instance variable. So to write it as a class variable, we have to write employee.company, because employee is the class and company is a variable written or defined inside this class. So we can either use employee.company or we can also use self.company. So when we use self.company, then we are writing it as an instance variable, and when we use employee.company, we are using it as a class variable. And since company is a class variable, no matter if we use it as a class variable or instance variable, the value will be same in both way. So let's only print employee1, and since this dunder str method is returning first name and company, it should print John and YouTube. So let's run this. Oops, actually I cannot use comma here. I can use plus, and for space I can use this space, and now we can run. Okay, so now it's printing John and YouTube. And as I mentioned, we can also use employee.company and it should also print the same thing. So John and YouTube. So the class variable is the variable whose value will be same for each instance or each objects. But sometimes there can be exception. So let's say we are creating the employee class for YouTube company, but let's say in YouTube we have one employee who is not working directly for YouTube. Let's say there is one employee who is actually the employee of Google company, but he is only working in YouTube for some specific projects. So in that case, we cannot describe that employee as the employee of YouTube because he is actually an employee of Google. So let's create one more employee, employee 3, and employee, his name is James Bond, let's say, and he is from California. Now James Bond is the employee of Google, but here the class variable company is defined as YouTube. So in this case, we can change the company of this employee into Google. So we can write employee3.company equals Google. Now this value for company will only be changed for this employee, employee 3, employee 1 and employee 2, and every other employees will still have YouTube as the value for company variable. But since we have an exception for this employee 3, we can change the company as Google. So we can print employee1.company, employee2.company, and employee3.company. And if we try to run this, then for employee 1 and employee 2, the company name is YouTube, but for employee 3, the company name is Google. And now if we look at this dunder_str method, before adding this employee 3, all the employees for this employee class belong to company YouTube, but now we have one employee who belongs to some other company. Now this employee.company and self.company can return different value. So let's try to return employee.company in this dunder_str method, and let's try to print all these employee objects. So employee 1, employee 2, and employee 3, and let's print it. Now as you can see, for employee 1 it's returning the first name and the company, so John and YouTube. For employee 2, it is also returning the first name and company, so Paul and YouTube. And for employee 3, it is returning first name and company. So the first name is James, that is correct, but the company of James is not YouTube because the company of James is Google, right? So this employee.company is not returning true values for all the objects, but if we change it to self.company and try to run it again, now it's returning YouTube for John and Paul and Google for James. So using the self.company is returning true values for all the employees. So the moral of the story is, even if we have class variable, it is better to use them as the instance variable inside functions or inside methods, because that way if certain object has distinct value for the same class variable, then using the self or using the variable as the instance variable will return true value every time. So basically in this lesson we learned about class variable, and we understood that the values of instance variables can be different for each object or for each instance, but the value of class variable will be same for each instance or each object of that class, and for some exception, we can also define a different class variable for the object as well. We will learn more about class and objects in the next lesson, so that's gonna do it for this video. I'll see you soon with the next video. Till then, keep learning. Goodbye.